And now it's my privilege to get us launched on our cybersecurity topic. And it really is a privilege to welcome former Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff. He is truly dedicated, as I'm sure you all know. He has been speaking in our network, he writes. He's truly dedicated to educating the American public to the threats that we face and finding the solutions to those threats. He served as Secretary of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009. He is also currently the chair of the Chertoff Group, which is a strategic international relations group that has offices in Washington, London, San Francisco, and providing essential wisdom globally. And he has also served as Assistant Attorney General, where he actually led the effort in terms of the investigation of the 9/11 terrorists, as well as Enron. And he has recently written a very provocative piece in the Washington Post, and many of you have seen it, about privacy, the new digital age, and really connects what we're doing today as the sub-theme that cyber is a new threat due to the IT revolution. And through most of the day, we're going to be looking at both the positive and the opportunities and the challenges of that, as you can see in the schedule. So it's my privilege to welcome Secretary Chertoff, and thank you for coming.
I'm sure you are essential, whatever you may have signed. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I do think it is really great that you have people coming from all over the country and different walks of life who are interested in international affairs and world affairs. I know there's a little bit of a tendency in the press to say we're entering an era in which the American public is turning inward. We don't want to be involved with the rest of the world. Some people call it isolationism. Some people say we're weary of the world. But I did speak with 9/11, and I was on duty on 9/11 that first day, and was one of the first people at the Operations Center during that day as we tried to respond and figure out what was coming next. 9/11 was a lesson to Americans that the oceans don't allow us to disengage from history. History will find us. Cyber has brought a new domain into the lexicon of what we're talking about with security. And it's a domain in which what occurs is as likely to happen on our own computers in our own offices as in another part of the world. When you think about cyber threats, if you go back to the Cold War, we used to think about our national security threats as things that would launch from a location, maybe in what used to be the Soviet Union, that we would be monitoring with satellites or U-2s, and we would see something coming. And this would all be what we might describe as an away game. It would be focused on what was happening outside of our borders. But a cyber attack, and I'll talk about the different kinds of challenges we face, comes from within our borders. And sometimes it's not even launched from a place outside the country. Sometimes it can be launched from inside the country. So we need to recognize this is a challenge or a set of challenges that we can't simply delegate to the military or to law enforcement, but each of us has a role to play because it's playing out on our own networks and our own machines. And I think that has been somewhat of a transformative idea. To begin, let me just make two general observations. The first is that the internet, when it was originally formed, ironically, was a Defense Department program designed to create resiliency in the communications area. And the idea was that if something went down in conventional communications, you could have a workaround that would avoid the problem and allow you to continue to communicate. But the premise of that was that everybody on the network was trusted. The idea was openness and speed. It was not how do you verify. That, of course, is no longer the kind of network we face. In a global world where the internet has allowed us to connect everything to everything else, actually the key ingredient now is trust. How do you know who you're dealing with? How do you know what their identity is? How do you know what their purpose is? And what has really revolutionized the world in the interconnectivity of the internet is that whenever you log on to something, whether you do it from your home computer or an office, as soon as you connect, by default, unless you take steps to protect yourself, everything is open. That is the opposite of the way we normally work in the physical world, where if you have, a valuable document, or you have money or something of that sort, you have it in your house, it's closed unless somebody's able to get into your house. Totally different in the internet, and that has really revolutionized the way we have to think about what items of value we allow to be part of the internet and we put on the internet. The second issue is we talk a little bit about it as cybersecurity, but I would argue it's a broader issue. It's data security. Because along with the interconnectivity of the web, what has also happened is the ability to collect, store, integrate, analyze, and disseminate data has exploded just in the last 5 years. And I think people are not aware of the amount of information they generate all the time with everything that they do. Some things are obvious. If you use social media, if you use Facebook, or if you use Twitter, it's obvious that's going to get out there. Although people may not necessarily understand exactly how long it persists and how it's disseminated. But also if you search using certain search engines, that's recorded. Financial transactions that you engage in are recorded as well by credit card companies or by other vendors. Geolocation on your phone allows you to be tracked. And even if you disable it, they've now discovered that when your phone connects to the network, there are very, very small imperfections in the way that connection occurs that are unique to every device, and that actually allow you to track a device even if you don't have geolocation enabled. Apparently it is the case, I saw it in the paper, that when you watch TV, the cable company is able to identify all the shows you watch, and they sell and do sell that data to people who want to have it. And then all of this has become compounded by the fact that many of these services operate within the cloud, and they're uploaded to the cloud, which, as many of you know, or most of you know, is not really a cloud. It's a giant group of servers someplace or in multiple places. And that means that the enterprise that operates the cloud is capable of cross-referencing and examining all the data, even if it's individually uploaded by individual users. So what we really are talking about here is the significance of the amount of data that is now collected. And what does that mean in terms of how we protect it? And that's a very big set of challenges. So I want to talk a little bit briefly about the kinds of threats that we face and what we have to think about in terms of dealing with it. Not surprisingly, the first and maybe the oldest threat we faced on the internet has been just ordinary criminality. And it's not surprising because crime's been with us pretty much forever. And once people started to engage in financial transactions on the internet, or you had internet-based banking or retail activity, pretty soon criminals were going to figure out how to exploit that. And what we have now are criminals who are quite sophisticated in identity theft, in trying to hack into bank accounts or credit card accounts. Recently, there was a group that hacked into some companies that were managing the back office of debit cards in India. And what they did is the group removed the withdrawal limits on the debit cards and then sent people out with cards to banks around the world. And I think that within a day they withdrew about $10 or $11 million. That kind of stuff's been going on really almost since the very beginning. Obviously, the financial institutions work to protect us, but we also have to do some things to protect ourselves in terms of what we sometimes call cyber hygiene, how we manage our passwords, not using the same password for our bank account that we may use for our Amazon account. So if it's compromised in one area, you haven't now opened the door to everything else. Thinking carefully about what kinds of transactions you do online, recognizing that when people say, oh, sign up for this, it's free. It's never free. You're paying for it with your information and your data, and that creates a vulnerability. But beyond the criminality, what we've seen more recently is the escalation of what some people describe as intellectual property theft or corporate espionage. And this has been much in the news lately. There's a group called Mandiant that did a report where they identified a single unit of the Chinese People's Liberation Army that has been involved for a long period of time in stealing business information and confidential technology and intellectual property that is used in order to give Chinese enterprises a competitive advantage. This is not merely the traditional intelligence collection that countries engage in, where you're trying to find out what another country's national security plans and capabilities are. This is really espionage on an industrial scale in order to use it for competitive business advantage in a global marketplace. And it's not just what you would imagine, which are highly technical plans and things of that sort, but it involved business process plans, it involved information about natural resources. Almost every kind of enterprise you could imagine was being penetrated by this single unit of the People's Liberation Army. Even media organizations had their email hacked into, presumably in order to determine where their sources were with respect to stories that were unflattering to some of the Chinese leadership. And the US government has really come out publicly, pretty much identified China as the country that is most systematic in trying to use the internet and even human spies in order to collect commercial information for use in helping their businesses get a competitive advantage globally. That's not to say China's the only country that does that. Others do, but China seems to be the most systematic. Parenthetically, the United States does not do that. Whatever intelligence collection we do not do in order to get commercial benefits for our businesses. We don't, call up, General Electric or whatever and say, oh, here's secret plans from another competitor, you can use those. But there are many countries that do that. And it's been estimated that billions of dollars of intellectual value are being transported out of the country overseas because of this. A more recent phenomenon and threat comes from what we call hacktivism, or politically motivated intrusions into data sets for an ideological reason. Sometimes this overlaps with criminality. Sometimes it involves trying to get information that's damaging to reputations or people because of an ideological issue. Somebody disagrees with a political position somebody took. So they're going to go try to get their emails and spread them out and maybe find something embarrassing. Groups like Anonymous and Lulzsec do this. And when they describe this phenomenon as, they call it doxing. It's trying to get your personal data. And we've seen it with respect to embarrassing things for some commercial enterprises that were put out. Where it makes it a little challenging is, unlike the criminals who are motivated by profit, it's sometimes difficult to predict what these groups will do. But this phenomenon will continue, I think, to increase over the years to come. Finally, we get into the most serious area, I think the one that concerns national security officials the most, and that is the possibility, the reality of disruptive and destructive attacks that could be carried out against critical infrastructure. Sometimes these attacks are more in the nature of a nuisance, like a denial of service attack, which overwhelms a website, for example, or a set of servers by flooding it with requests for data that kind of break the system or interfere with it. That doesn't actually destroy it, but it can impede it. And a number of the tier 1 banks around the country have experienced these, probably motivated, according to what most people think, by groups that are sympathetic to the Iranians. And because the Iranians are experiencing sanctions, they're kind of striking back. But supposing we go further than that, supposing we have adversaries, nation states or terrorist groups or ideological groups that actually want to destroy networks or use networks as a way of destroying or interfering with actual physical critical infrastructure. Last year, attackers, again, who were, I think, surmised to be sympathetic to the Iranians, attacked Saudi Aramco, the energy company, and Rosgas, the Qatar natural gas company, and destroyed tens of thousands of workstations and machines and data in those enterprises. That actually eliminated things from the network. We know that it is possible when you have physical operations connected to the internet, industrial control systems, or what they call SCADA systems, you can actually affect the performance of the system by using the internet to penetrate in. And that could result in the kind of damage that would actually not only have a physical impact, but actually cause a significant loss of life if it affected a water system or a transportation system or an electric system or something of that sort. And that is the issue, I think, that concerns national security people the most. How do we make sure our critical infrastructure doesn't have a cyber 9/11? In fact, in the last year, a part of the Department of Homeland Security, which is the cyber emergency response team that deals with industrial control systems, has put out a series of warnings suggesting that we have found various kinds of malicious tools or malware in the systems of natural gas companies and pipelines. The idea being maybe they're doing reconnaissance, maybe they're trying to steal data, but maybe they're implanting things, whoever it may be, that they could turn on if they wanted to impede or disable a system. This problem is about to step up exponentially because we're now entering the era of what some people call the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is the fact that everything from your toaster to your refrigerator, your thermostat, to your automobile is all going to be wireless and all talking to everything else. This is designed, for example, in the case of the smart grid, to make sure, oh look, we can manage all of your energy use, we can conserve it. If you're out of the house, we can lower the thermostat. If you're in the house, we can raise it. If the temperature outside changes, we can affect it. We can monitor your use. We can tailor how we price things to your degree of use. It's all great from an efficiency standpoint. But here's the thing. If it's all connected and it's networked, and particularly if it's wireless, those are all apertures through which malicious activity can occur. And that means someone can use it to steal the data, track when you're home and when you're not home, put things into a network of critical infrastructure that could be used to steal or to disrupt things. I know of a case, for example, a couple of years ago, where an enterprise that did a pretty good job of protecting its network, or so they thought, discovered that there was a malicious tool sitting in the network that had been there for months that was collecting information. And they figured out forensically how it got there. They discovered that they hadn't realized they had a remote connection to a thermostat in a building away from the main headquarters. That was unprotected. And through checking various entry points to the enterprise, adversaries were able to get in that way, get into the enterprise and roam around and have kind of a free hand taking what they wanted to have. This is going to get more serious. Academics have conducted experiments with automobiles to show that through the connections on OnStar and GPS and things like that, it is possible in some instances to actually hack into a car and affect its steering, the way its engine operates, and the way it accelerates. This was an episode of Homeland. But they've also, in the Black Hat conference earlier this year, they presented data about experiments that showed you could remotely hack into wirelessly connected insulin pumps and pacemakers and affect those. Because the wireless element, every time you send something wirelessly, you're opening up an aperture. What that means is we have to start thinking about designing this set of new tools in a way in which security becomes a fundamental ingredient of the functioning of the device itself. It can't be an afterthought, it can't be a patch, because otherwise we could find ourselves in serious jeopardy. And I think this is a challenge that we've only begun to get our arms around, because many of the consumer items that we buy are designed by companies that are mostly interested in producing things that consumers find interesting and entrancing and useful, but they're not necessarily thinking about what the downside of that is. So that's the challenge. And how do we deal with it? I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that, and then I'm happy to open up for a few minutes of questions. Well, first, what's the government going to do about it? There have been efforts to get the government to help support a couple of endeavors here, recognizing that because most of the networks that we're talking about are in private hands, the government is not going to sit in everybody's network and watch and protect against all the malware that's coming in and out. And I don't think we frankly would want the government to be that deeply embedded in everything that we do. But the government can help us in a couple of ways. The government can facilitate information sharing about the threats that are out there and the tools, the IP addresses things come from, the signatures of the code that we've discovered are problematic. And we can help each other if we can share that information among ourselves. The problem is the way the law is currently configured, there are liability risks in sharing information, and there's not a lot of incentive to do it. And so there's been an effort led by Chairman Mike Rogers of the House Intelligence Committee to get a bill over the last 2-3 years that would actually create a legal safe harbor to do this information sharing and encourage more government to private and private to private sharing. That has not yet gotten out of Congress. Frankly, there are some people who think the government should have nothing to do with the internet. But as I used to say to people when I was in office, if that's your attitude, I promise you there's going to be a government in the internet anyway, but it'll be the Chinese government instead of the US government. So you got to decide which one you prefer. In the meantime, the president has issued an executive order that at least is encouraging information sharing from the government to the private sector, and hopefully that will have some impact. The next thing we need to deal with, need to get from the government, I think, is some guidance in terms of the standards of cybersecurity. How much is enough? What should we be doing? And how do we reward people who invest in cybersecurity and create a disincentive for people who don't want to be bothered? I'm talking about businesses. And again, there have been proposals to come up with some general standards and accompany it with rules that would create liability protections for those who do the kind of investment that's necessary. There's been some pushback by people who, again, don't want any government involvement in the area. And while the executive order has created a process for trying to develop the standards on a voluntary basis, there's been no ability and there's no authority to create the kind of liability protection that would actually create a real incentive structure. Finally, we need to have and develop a set of rules of engagement for what we might describe as cyber war. What are the rules if somebody attacks our critical infrastructure? I'm not talking about just stealing intellectual property. I'm talking about actually damaging a transportation system, a water system, hospitals, and actually causing a loss of life. What would constitute an act of war? What would our response be? What is the doctrine? What would we tell the world is the range of what we think we would do in response to that? We developed rules of engagement and a doctrine after the birth of the nuclear age. And because the strategy in a post-nuclear era was different than in a purely conventional era. And we need to do that now that the area of cyber is likely to be a domain of warfare in the future. Finally, what do we do ourselves? And that's, I think, the real challenge for all of us. It's easy to view this as either a problem that's overwhelming or a problem that is too technical. So I want to, before I take some questions, leave you with these thoughts. Although there is a technical element to dealing with this problem, fundamentally it's not a technical problem, it's a human problem. It's about human beings creating threats. And that means it requires engagement at a policy level and a strategic level by people who run businesses. It can't just be turned over to somebody who has an engineering degree. You have to ask yourself fundamental questions. What is most important to me in the data that I have? How do I build an architecture so that I protect the things that are most important and maybe do a little less protection for things that are less important so that I can balance efficiency and cost against security? How do I segment my information so that if it's like a ship, folks in the naval academy will understand that. The way a ship is built, if you have a breach in one area of the ship, it's possible to close it off so the ship doesn't get totally flooded. How do you manage to segment the architecture of your cybersecurity? How do you become aware of what's going on inside your network, not really what's coming in and out from outside? Many people still tell me that they practice what they call, or what I call the M&M theory of cybersecurity. Hard outside, soft center. But many of the threats actually come in from the inside. It's an insider, a person in the organization who has foolishly or maybe maliciously done something that invited a piece of malware into the network, or they went to a website and they didn't realize that they were triggering something coming in, or they took a thumb drive that they found or someone gave them and they stuck it into their computer and they didn't realize there was a piece of malware on the thumb drive. So you got to be aware of what's going on in the network as well. And finally, you got to recognize that it's not possible, if you have an enterprise of value, to totally guarantee that you will not be penetrated. You can't eliminate the risk. You can manage the risk. So you have to have a reasonable set of expectations. And with that approach, I think it is possible to reduce and mitigate the threats that we face. But it's the kind of struggle that's going to require not only government intervention, but really the commitment of everybody who has items of value or infrastructure of significance that they have responsibility for and that they operate using modern day networks. So with that, maybe take about 5 minutes of questions. Yes?
Thank you very much. How would you characterize the Stuxnet Worm? And do you think that the reaction, the attack on the Aramco system was related?
Well, and so based on what's been reported in the paper, in the news media, Stuxnet was the use of a piece of malware to actually affect the functioning of centrifuges in Iran. And there's certainly been a lot of speculation that the attack on Saudi Aramco was in response to that, or it may have been in response to the sanctions that have been, biting into the Iranians. Whatever the truth is about, Stuxnet and the circumstances of it, it's clear people now are thinking about the possibility of using cyber as a way of introducing destructive forces into actual physical machinery. And that genie is not going back in the bottle. We're going to see more of that. Yes, over there.
Hi, my name is Jason Smith from the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Thank you for being here, first of all. You mentioned Black Hat conferences momentarily, which essentially has formerly illegal hackers, and they're being kind of encouraged to work usually for the government and to help combat cybercrime. How central has this effort been in beating up against the cyber wars instead of?
So the question was about, I mentioned the Black Hat conference, and the question was about the use of people who used to hack into things maliciously and becoming kind of what they call, going from black hat to white hat. And the Black Hat conference is really a collection of people, many of them are security folks, and they have government people who speak there, who are interested in this issue of hacking and security. I think it's probably fair to say that, there's the old expression, it takes a thief to catch a thief. There are folks who have begun hacking, maybe not maliciously, but perhaps not strictly within the rules, who at some point mature out of that and become white hat or ethical hackers. Actually, a part of cybersecurity is what we call penetration testing or red teaming, where you get people who are skilled at hacking who will test, with permission, they will test your system in order to expose vulnerabilities. My firm, we sometimes get called upon to bring folks in to assess security, and part of what we'll do is bring people who know how to hack. So I think it's almost like any other system or capability. The ability to hacking is itself neutral. I mean, there's no moral element to it. It's the purpose for which it's being done that determines whether you're dealing with bad behavior or good behavior. Yes?
Most of your talk has been geared on defense.
Right.
Is it safe to say that General Electric knows that they're being hacked into and they are doing the reverse hacking into everybody else?
No, that's not fair to say. I can't pick out General Electric, but I will say this to you. Obviously, you would assume the U.S. government invests money in its own capabilities to do either collect intelligence or even to do something if you had a war. But in terms of the private sector, I know there are people out there who advocated or argued that if a private enterprise is hacked into and something is stolen,
And it's often possible to tell, at least the proximate launch point, that the private sector ought to strike back and ought to take its information back or damage or destroy the people who did it. So I would say this, if someone burglarizes your house, are you allowed to go into their house and take your stuff back? The answer is no. Actually, to do that would be a crime. It would be a crime in cyber as well. I also have cautioned people, and I know that people get a different view on this, but a lot of times the server which you identify as the cause of the attack may be remotely controlled. You may wind up damaging an innocent party. You may wind up taking down a server that's also keeping the lights on in a hospital. If you're a private enterprise, you want to take down a hospital in another country because the liability and the potential criminal consequences will be enormous. The difficulty of attributing where an attack comes from and who's responsible is so significant that, in my view, for an enterprise to do anything that would be destructive in response would be gambling at a minimum, gambling the viability of the enterprise and possibly exposing individuals to serious personal liability. So there are some things you could do, very subtle things, but I think you got to be really careful in this area.
We have time for one more question.
All right, wow, how do I pick? All right, I'll let you pick.
I think we'll go to that side since there's a microphone on that side. Please ask them.
Thank you. I'm Donna Rose from Worcester, Massachusetts. We have a way to go after and prosecute traditional criminals. What about cyber criminals?
Well, it's certainly, I mean, we do prosecute cyber criminals, and there's some big cases recently which have been successful. One of the challenges is this. Because they operate globally, many of the most sophisticated rings operate, a lot of them operate, frankly, in Eastern Europe and Russia. Now here I have to say, the Chinese do not appear to be big players. I mean, there are obviously criminals in China like in the US, but the Chinese government is not looking to do stealing bank account stuff. That's not what they're interested in. But in Russia and in Eastern Europe, there are some very sophisticated criminal groups. Often it's difficult, even though you could make a case against them, to actually apprehend them. When I was in the office, we wanted to bring a case against someone who was responsible for a very big ring of cyber criminals who had stolen like tens of millions of credit card numbers, because at one point he ventured out of Eastern Europe. I think he went to Turkey, maybe wrong about that, and we were able to get him arrested in Turkey and bring him back to the US. But many countries either don't have the capability to really arrest people, or they don't have the legal authority to arrest people for these kinds of crimes, or sometimes they're just not that interested or dedicated. So one of the things we need to try to do is exert pressure on countries which are more or less safe havens for cyber criminals to really devote some energy and capital to building up a capability to enforce the law against those people. Otherwise, you have these dark zones where criminals can operate pretty much with people. Anyway, I can see a lot of questions. There's a panel coming up afterwards. I'm sure you'll have great questions for them. And again, thank you for your engagement.